Welcome, everybody. This is my conversation with Catherine Austin Fitz. Seems to me, the only human on planet Earth who actually gets, understands, and clearly explains what's going on with the financial, banking, and economic environment in the context of COVID. Catherine was born in 1950 in the city of brotherly, and I should say, I guess in this day and age, sisterly love, being Philadelphia. Catherine, there's a small village in the village I was born in, Calabria, Italy, called Philadelphia as well.
Really?
Yes. Yeah. It's a Greek term meaning loving your brothers and sisters. That's why Philadelphia is known as the city of brotherly love. And
well, there's a Philadelphia, Mississippi.
Yes, I know
Yeah,
as well.
yeah.
Yeah. And so I was intrigued to know that you did a BA in history, and then you did an MBA. And then you were an investment banker. You were assistant secretary for HUD, the Housing and Urban Development Department under President Bush. And then you've been an investment advisor since. Is there anything else you'd like to tell our audience about yourself?
Yeah, so after I finished being assistant secretary, I started an investment bank in Washington that was extremely successful until we engaged in 11 years of litigation with the Department of Justice.
Was this?
I like to say I got an outward bound law degree. And so that was part of what forced me to understand the extent of the financial corruption. And when I finished that, I'd gotten so disgusted with the corporate media. I don't even call them the media now. I just call them the shriekometer. So I got so disgusted, I decided I'd just start answering people's questions. I was doing radio shows literally to stay alive, to protect myself.
Wow.
And so I started to answer these questions, and those questions grew into two businesses. One was an investment advisory company that used to do individual investment advisory. Now we just do a screens with a money manager. And that's a very interesting dynamic area. And then we published the Solari report.
Right.
And my goal is to, and it really comes out of doing the investment advisory, it was initially created to serve the investment advisory clients, is to just help them keep and refresh a good map of what's going on, so they know how to navigate. They can see their own opportunities. They can understand the risks and not get tricked.
And so Solari is the company you established last year in 2020. Is that correct?
No, so I established Solari in 1994, but we took it operational in 1998.
Right.
I started the Solari report in 2008, and the investment advisory company in 2007. And then last year, I started a European affiliate, Solari Europa, with a Dutch partner here in the Netherlands.
Right. Explain to our audience, it's mind-boggling, really. You're exposing or finding that $21 trillion of spending by the U.S. military just unaccounted for.
Actually, in 2019, 35 trillion was the undocumentable adjustments, and they're more for the 2 years before. So we're now over 50 trillion.
50 trillion. So just put that into context. Put that into context for the audience. The U.S. Annual budget is what, 14 trillion?
No, the U.S. annual budget is probably about 2 trillion now, maybe a little bit higher.
2 trillion? Yeah.
I'd have to go check.
I'm sorry, I'm confusing
because we're so outspending our tax flow.
Right.
But figure the military budget's approximately $1 trillion.
Right.
But if you look at the undocumentable adjustments, the total debt is $35 trillion, or is headed towards 30 trillion.
Right
now, I think it's at 28, but when they pass the stimulus bill,
it's
going to jump, and we're pretty much headed towards 30 trillion. So the undocumentable adjustments is significantly more than the total outstanding debt of the country. And what's interesting, Rocco, is if you look at the central banking model, we're issuing tons of debt we don't need to. We could just issue currency from the treasury rather than debt. That's sort of one waste of money. And then the other waste of money, of course, is if you issue debt and then suck the money out of the back door and the citizens are stuck with the debt.
Well, I lost that 12-year battle in the Supreme Court of Canada with respect to our central bank, that very
Right.
same notion. And, as it went up through the courts, Catherine, the judges realized how massive the issue was and how fraudulent the government's being with printing money, giving it to the private banks, and the private banks lending it back to the government at 4%.
I know it. It's unbelievable.
It's fraud with capital letters. So let me, if I can, let me just briefly introduce myself to you and the audience, so that we both know where we're both coming from in the event that I may put a proposition to you and you're thinking in your mind, well, where's Rocco coming from? I was born on a farm, the 17th generation of farmers in southern Italy.
Wow.
The last enclave of true functional anarchy.
Where did they come from before Canada?
Oh, that's a long story. They go back to the Galatians in Anatolia and Turkey.
Oh, really?
Really, but the last name Galati comes from Galicia. My people go back 2,000 years to Anatolia under the Table of Nations. They're descendants of Gomer, Ashkenaz's father. Leave Genesis in the Bible. So, but I trace my personal family back to 1512, where I'm from. I've been a constitutional lawyer for 33 years with my primary initial expertise in tax. I've litigated every major proposed global trade deal since 1997 in Canada, the MAI, the FTAA, the CETA recently. And so I've seen the development of this global agenda in terms of structure and how the map has been being laid down on the ground with the mega cities and the whole thing. People think they organically sprung up. Obviously, it was one of the terms of the multilateral agreement on investment. And people are often not in tune with the connection between our neoliberal constitutions and bills of rights and the connection with tax, which is simply an exacting of labor on the tax side and a redistribution of wealth and monies taxed on the budgetary other side. And the Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights of 1689, the U.S. Revolution and Bill of Rights, and the French Declaration of the Man's Right were all tax revolts, essentially. And people have to remember that. And so, I was also at the forefront of all the criminal charges laid under the so-called War of Terror 15, 20 years ago. And that was a whole different agenda. So what I'd like to do with you, Catherine, is just lay, because a lawyer can't help but being a lawyer. So I almost saw this like a trial or cross-examination in structuring what I would love to talk to you about today. And I've got 15 talking points, and I'm going to give them to you so that your mind subliminally works on them while we go through them. And
but just before you do that, let me say I've been working on a big paper on tax.
Oh, you have?
And I would love to have a consultation with you while we're talking about where the opportunities are to litigate on tax.
Oh, for sure.
Okay.
You can consult me. Always pro bono.
No, I mean, we'll do it right now. We'll do it
on camera. Fine. Okay. When we get to it, let's talk about it. Okay. So here are the talking points I want to talk about very briefly so the audience knows as well where we're going. Number one, in watching your videos, you're brilliant, but what a lot of brilliant people do is you think in 4 or 5 steps.
Right.
So and so you're assuming that the audience necessarily knows the background you need to know to understand your incredible insight. So first, I want to talk about what is money. 2, the history of money. 3, the history of banking. 4, central banking. 5, the relationship between human value and labor and monetary value. 6, humans as a commodity resource and not a sovereign divine creation. 7, transhumanism, digitizing and robotization of humans. 9, the pandemic and what I'm beginning to call now, I've coined the term COVIDism, and the globalist agenda.
Yeah.
It's McCarthyism, fascism, communism. You name it. This is COVIDism as far as I'm concerned. It's a cult. It's a religious. It's almost administered like a cult. Then I would like to talk about what intrinsic human endeavors, products, and labor critical to human existence do the globalists still need to conquer? 11, how does COVIDism and its measures fit into the seismic shift in banking, finance, and the new world economic order? 12,
Okay.
How does the short, medium, and long-term globalist agenda play out in your mind? 13, how do humans counteract this agenda if they're not in agreement with it? And then 14, I'm hoping you can tell me while we're talking about tax, what to do with my cash in my bank account. And then 15, I want to cap off talking about the reaction to your work, if you're willing to speak about that. And
Okay, I'm just looking for my tax file
okay.
with all my tax questions. Wait a minute.
So are you okay with starting and having the discussion on what is money?
Yes, although in every area you're bringing up, I'm very much a portfolio strategist.
Right.
And it's my tendency to try and integrate information from lots of different experts.
Right.
So there's not a topic you're going to bring up where I'm not going to send you to this person or that person.
Right. No problem.
Right.
That's right.
Right.
Okay. So can we start the conversation on what is money? Because I think a lot of people confuse money with currency. And can I give you my working definition of money and then ask
Sure.
you some questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
In the course of the Bank of Canada case I did, I defined money as, quote, a mutually agreed upon medium of exchange by which past, present, or future debt or obligation is extinguished between a creditor and a debtor. And then I further subdivide that into two types of money, what I call real money and nebulous and fictitious money, or money of exchange versus money of account, commodity versus credit. So can you explain to us what your view of money is and how it manifests itself in the day-to-day life?
Right. So I think of it in a simple way, not in a legal way. To me, money is any system created to transact time and assets in a standardized form that allows people to transact real assets through time and space.
Okay, but where does consensus between those parties come into that definition or equation? Or agreement, rather?
So the only agreement is whether or not they trade.
Right.
So it's the ability to trade with free will.
Right. And incorporated in that, and the assumption in that is that they agree to the medium of exchange of whatever that money form takes, correct?
Right. They agree to the medium and the price.
And
so
the price.
There's an intuitive pricing, and and that's one of the reasons why what's happening now is so dramatic, because they're trying to completely remove price from the equation.
Right.
And say we can completely control price. Now, the thing to understand about money is literally anybody can create money anywhere, anytime, but that doesn't mean they can build the consensus necessary for it to be liquid and to turn into a powerful medium of exchange or to price well.
Okay, and so you're saying historically that's changed, that the bargaining power per se on how to arrive at a consensus, or at least a bargaining of what value you put to that form of money, is now gone to a control of imposition, or it's mandated?
So I would say historically there have been two primary kinds of money. One is money in the central banking warfare model.
Mm-hmm.
So the central banks print money or create money, and the military makes sure somebody takes it.
Yeah, okay.
Think of this as an extraction scheme.
Right.
But because you have the military to back it up, that's what causes the trust, the consensus, call it trust, call it, whatever. Trust or fear, whichever it is, it's what creates the consensus. There's another kind of currency, and that is where either the intrinsic value of the medium, such as gold, or the confidence in the syndicate that's issuing the currency, can create the necessary liquidity and consensus without force. So we've seen that happen many times in history. And it's
Right.
one of the reasons people promote gold and silver and other forms of, essentially real assets being used for currency.
Right. Well, I would suggest to you gold and silver historically, I mean, they've been around since ancient times. It has that stability only because it looks like real money. You can hold it. It's physical as opposed to
So,
credit.
right. So part of the attract, I always say have enough gold to bribe the border guards. That one of the attractions of to me, the best currency is one that can move, and the best money, it can move both digitally and physically.
Okay.
And so if you look at transaction costs, there are reasons why if I'm trading with somebody in Bangladesh, I want to be able to transact digitally. At the same time, I want to be able to put it in my pocket and walk away, and and not need electricity to turn it into a medium of exchange. And
Right.
so currency, gold and silver are, there's nothing better. Although, the folks during the rape of Russia, when they brought down the whole financial system in Russia, what folks will tell you is vodka was better than gold and silver.
I would tend to agree with them. But really the ease of transferring the money is merely a means of transferring. That begs the question, what value is reflected by the underlying form of that money when you transfer it? So we still have to get back to, well, I'm transferring you some gold certificates, or I'm transferring you credit for your 1,000,000 barrels of oil for our 10,000 tons of wheat, if we're exchanging real money through commodities as between nation states, right? So,
Right. And so
but there are some forms of money that are merely, their intrinsic value is nothing but intellectual and credit, and only exists electronically based on the trust of the issuer and the agreement that it will extinguish the debt between two parties, right?
right. So gold has an intrinsic value that doesn't depend on trust.
Right.
If you pay me with gold, I don't need to trust you after we make the trade, so long as I've verified it's real gold. So as long as I'm sure that the gold is authentic and of that quality, the trade's over, I don't need to trust you.
Okay.
So many arrangements that we have, so many forms of money depend not just on trust of the different party you're trading with, but trust of a legal system and an enforcement system.
Right.
And as you know, that's the problem,
Right.
because the legal and enforcement system is full of double standards and immunity and problems, and that's why it's breaking down.
Right. So just to stick with your gold analogy or example, just to clarify it for the audience, take that same analogy and you say, I'm transferring you a gold certificate. The certificate is not necessarily, that 100 troy ounces of gold is not necessarily backed by an actual physical bullion. Then we're into a trust transaction, right?
So that's still a trust transaction. Now, by making it a certificate in gold, you may be limiting the amount of parties you have to trust. But
Right.
you have to trust where the gold is. You have to trust that it's been audited. It's really there. You have to trust that it's gold, not tungsten. There's many. I'll never forget. We did when the first gold and silver ETFs first came out. I did a serious due diligence on them and realized, this is a bank IOU priced in gold. That's what this is. And yet I couldn't persuade other investment advisors to be careful, because it was a much more convenient, low cost trading mechanism. So finally, I got one of my attorneys and we wrote a long dissertation on GLD and SLV and what they really were and what the different things you had to trust and whether or not they were trustworthy. And anytime I could get an investment advisor to read it, they'd say, "Holy cow!" And then the next thing you know, they were doing something a little bit more clunky, but a little bit more trustworthy.
Right. And so the bottom line, moving on to another topic, is that the takeaway that I think people should have is when they hear the word money, they should not simply equate it with cash currency in their hand or the balance on a bank account. It takes many forms, and some money is more real than other. Is that a fair comment?
Right. And I want to take it even deeper than that.
Right.
Because when you say to me, "Oh, I've made a lot of money," what I hear as an investment banker is, "I'm a home builder and now I've accumulated more hammers."
Right.
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 What I'm interested in is, okay, what are you going to create with those hammers? What are you going to build with those hammers? And if all you're going to do is just accumulate more hammers, I think you're a putz.
Right.
It's like, we're here to play human civilization, not to play, get more hammers.
Right.
So we've been taken over as a society with, in the last couple decades, with what one of my allies describes as hyper materialism. And it's produced a whole bunch of people or a real, I don't know, a culture acting in the economic sphere, which has literally become divorced from the end result of what an economy really is all about.
Which is to serve human needs.
Right, but it's also, it's like watching people go around in circles in a variety of speculations where they're totally manipulated. I mean, I used to call myself the cleaning lady of financial fraud because I've done a lot with financial fraud. But hypermaterialism and printing money is how you persuade millions, if not billions, of people to walk away from building real civilization and liquidate their communities, their families, and their entire civilization. Okay, so, and they think they're making money, and they're not. They're just liquidating anything worth owning or having.
Right. So on the topic of printing money, can we just briefly review the notion of paper currency? And okay. I think a lot of people don't understand it. I mean, the Chinese in the 11th century devised the first paper currency called, ironically enough, during the Yuan dynasty, which is still their yuan is still their currency. But in Europe, we didn't see paper currency really until near the Renaissance.
Right.
It's an evolution of bills of exchange or receipts for commodities.
Right. Although you saw during the Middle Ages, you saw a letter of credits.
Yeah, but that was only in the Muslim world. The Muslim world from the
no. The Templars did letters of credits.
Well, the Templars.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they were living with the Muslims.
Well, I don't know if they picked it up, but the Templars were, one of their claims to fame was they were building networks,
right,
where with a letter you could literally pick up a gold deposit, 100 miles away, 200 miles away.
Right.
It was their ability to create that international system of money that was one of their reasons for rising to so much power.
Right, but the Muslims in both in various caliphates, including Europe, from the 8th to 12th century, actually had a near quasi-modern banking system. They actually gave us credit, checks, promissory notes, savings accounts, loans, trusts, exchange rates, and the transfer of credit and debt. Now, I'm not denying that the Christian Europeans shortly after picked up on that banking system, but my point is that paper money, in terms of history, is relatively recent.
Yes.
You'd agree, right?
Yes, I would agree.
And so the issuance of paper money up until 1971, when Nixon abandoned the gold standard, was traditionally backed up by something else. Is that correct? So if you printed a dollar, you had to have something backing up that paper money.
Right. And I would, what Nixon did was he cut the tie to gold,
Right.
but he doubled down on the tie to force.
Military.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So to me, there's a relationship when we cut away from gold and when we got, our GIS and other satellite systems up globally when no one else had the same thing.
Right.
So, we controlled the sea lanes very clearly at that point, but it was during the 70s that we added the satellites, and
Right.
that gave the US an unbelievable ability to do surveillance and intelligence and control globally.
Right. So the other thing maybe you can explain and confirm to the audience is that before the advent of central banks, and I'm going to get to that in a second, paper money was printed individually, but privately by each different bank.
Right.
People, I think, assume that governments printed all the money forever.
No,
in
and
history,
and
but
in the 1800s, if you walk into my bank in the United States,
right.
they have framed copies of currency that they used to issue.
Right. And so
Yeah.
I just want to go through a list of because I want to segue into the central banking system, Catherine. England had, and a central bank should not be confused with a public bank. What happened when the central banks emerged was that the national government gave that bank the monopoly to print paper currency. You confirm that? And so
Right. Although the big debate has always been, does the government own the central bank
right.
or do private bankers own the central bank? It's always been a war, and right now the private central bankers are not only winning, but they're taking over the treasury government function around the
Right.
world.
And
Right.
so I just want to rattle off some dates for the audience so they understand how recent this is. The Bank of England was 1694. The Bank of Hindustan in India, 1770. The Central
Sweden
Bank
was
of,
before the Bank of England. Sweden
sorry?
is the earliest.
I'm sorry?
Sweden is the earliest, so Sweden came before the Bank of England.
Yeah, you're right. 1660, Sweden issued its first
Right.
notes, and the bank that did it, when I understand, went under for shortly after that.
They're back. They're
yeah,
back.
you're quite. Thank you for correcting me. And then we had the Central Bank of Bengal and Bihar in 1773, and then the Federal Reserve printing notes in 1913. And you might be interested to know that Canada was late in the game. Our Central Bank of Canada was only created in 1937. So can
Right.
you please explain to the audience what the central banking system is, how it works, and how it plays into the monetary policy we've lived through in our lifetime?
So there's variations in every country, and of course the big debate is it privately owned or owned by government.
Right.
Because really, as we pointed out when we started to discuss, there's no reason why the government can't issue its own money.
Right.
Now, for political reasons, so if you look at the US construct until recently, I would say it was a balance of power between the private bankers who run the financial system and the government. So the government controlled the treasury and fiscal policy, and the central bankers controlled the monetary policy. And so there was a balance of power between the electorate and the private bankers. And now we've had a financial coup, and the central bankers are taking over both functions, and that's part of what's happening. So, and in the last 30 or 40 years, you've seen this battle going on where central banks were not privately owned. The private owners have been trying to move in and get it privately owned. So, if you've ever read Princes of Yen or seen the documentary Princes,
Right.
it's about the battle over the Japanese.
Yeah, but
Okay, so what does the central banks do? The central banks basically run the monetary policy, and with that, they end up, as the governments have borrowed more money, running and controlling the government debt market. So think of it this way: a government can't has its bank accounts run by the central bank or their owners as agents, and they have their bond issuance managed by those same banks that own the central bank, and then they have different sort of servicing and regulatory functions done by that. And if you look at how all of that works, you have an unbelievably over expensive way of running your financial system, uh, and having it controlled by central bankers. It's basically, you know how in churches you have a 10% tithe? It's
Yes.
essentially a tithing system
Yeah. Yeah.
whereby, now let me talk to you about the magic of what happened when we created the European central banks.
Okay. Can you give the audience a rough idea of when that was?
Uh, well, so we talked about Sweden and the Netherlands. It
England,
was
yeah.
in the 1600s we saw
Right.
Sweden, the Dutch, the
Right.
British. But let's talk about what happens in 1600. Have you ever read Sun Tzu, The Art of War?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Sun Tzu is military strategy for a country that doesn't have a bond market. Okay.
Right.
Because it's about warfare when the government has to tax on a pay-as-you-go basis to have a war.
Right.
The thing that put the European central banks on the map was they invented the bond market.
Can you explain to our audience what the bond market is? What is a bond?
A bond is an IOU. So let's say I want to borrow $100 for you. I write an IOU and say I owe you $100, and let's say the interest is 1%. So I owe you, 1% every year, and you're $100 back. And so when corporations or governments borrow in large amounts, they issue bonds, which are securities. It's not just an IOU, it's a real security. And in most cases, it's tradable, it's liquid. So the United States government is the largest bond issuer on the planet.
Municipality issue them when they get in troubles to raise funds.
No, municipalities issue them to build a school,
Right.
to do infrastructure. Most municipal bonds is for infrastructure and capital accounts. Now it's deteriorated in the last 20 years. But
and if I have a bearer bond, I can sell it to my neighbor, right? I can transfer it to my neighbor.
In theory.
In theory, okay.
So the secrecy in the bond market has become much more corporate. Anyway,
Okay.
but the beauty of creating the bond market was that enabled you to wage war without the taxes hitting the citizens. In other words, if I'm asking the citizens to send their strong young men to die in my wars, the last thing, that's going to be politically popular is I ask them to increase their taxes by 30% to also finance this. Okay.
Right.
So what happened, the brilliance of the central banking warfare model was, by creating a bond market, they figured out a way to engage in significant wars, before you hit the peasants with the taxes. Now,
Right.
here's why this is important. Let's say, you're one country, I'm another country. The Iron Bank, Game of Thrones, the Iron Bank agrees to buy my bonds. So I issue the bonds I need to launch a war against your country. Now, if I win, then I can rape your country and pay back
Right.
the bonds without ever, having to ask my citizens to pay taxes.
Right.
So the central banking warfare model that was developed in the 1600s, thank you, Northern Europe, really put warfare at the it had always been at the top of the economic food chain, but it really turned war into a massive institutionalized business, and
Right.
and put very big money behind force as an economic model.
Okay. And that's because it's paper money. Can I explain to the audience, with your permission?
Sure.
You can disagree with me if you want. 100
Okay.
years prior to the advent of those paper bonds, the way European kings and queens waged war was by going to the Medici and Vatican bankers, and they went bankrupt as a result. And that's how the Medici and the Vatican Bank became ultra rich, because they had to pay back in gold or silver.
Right. So gold and silver shrunk the game. Of course, unless you
Right.
could go to Latin America and find big silver loads and bring more silver back. I will tell you this, one of the, if you go back and you look at the history of what put the Venetians and the Medicis on the map, one of it was accounting and the other was insurance.
Right.
So it was and it's just like the Templars. The Dutch are very similar. It's these technologies that allow you to build trust and hold contractual agreements over a great distance and through time.
Right.
And the more you can do that, the more powerful you become.
Well,
And
maybe if I can also explain to the audience that the monks in Tuscany invented double entry accounting, but they couldn't take off with it because the Arabs who had invented the zero had an advantage before the caliphate fell.
that is true.
And the Christians refused to use the zero at first because it would confuse the amount. So the Florence bankers insisted when they adopted the zero that when you issued a note, a credit note, you had to write out the full sum, like $250, to avoid confusion, which still
Right.
exists on our checks today, right?
Right.
Right. And
Right.
so
I still write it out on our checks.
right. And that came. So you're saying it was the accounting and the advent of accounting that really,
And insurance. Insurance has been incredibly important to building financial liquidity.
So educate me on that. I wasn't aware of that. Who's running the insurance companies?
Well, the first thing
underwriting
was
the Medici and Vatican banks.
So if you go back and you look at the Venetians or anybody who traded particularly by sea, you would have expeditions go out, you would have ships go out.
Right.
And if a ship was owned and its cargo was owned entirely by one person and there was no way to syndicate out the risk, then one ship going down could wipe out a whole family.
Right. And so this, go ahead. Sorry, Catherine.
Right. So it's the ability to diversify project risk in trading.
Okay. And so let's take it to post 1971. Tell us, I mean, we see the chairman of the Fed or the governor of the Bank of Canada every quarter come out like, the Greyhound on Greyhound Dogs Day and say, we're not, interest rates are not going up a quarter. They're not going down a quarter. We're going to stay steady. One of the central features of the central bank is they dictate an interest rate policy. Do they not?
So they have a lot of sway over interest rates, right, which they can have to the extent they can amass significant credit through the federal credit mechanism and intervene broadly in the markets on a secret basis. So if you look at all the tools and techniques they have to manage interest rates, they're very significant when it works. Right. But it depends on, I would say, significant secrecy in their arrangements.
Right. And they don't act independently of each other, do they? The central banks.
So the central banks all coordinate through the Bank of International Settlements.
Right. Can you explain that to the audience, which is in Basel, Switzerland, correct?
Well, that's the big mystery. I can describe it, but I can't explain it because the big mystery is, where does their clout really come from, really? Right. So if you,
you can ask the same thing about Bill Gates and George Soros, and that it's a similar.
Well, yeah, because system, right? the Bank of International Settlements has immunity.
Yes, I know.
So it's in essence a sovereign entity, and I was just watching Dr. Astrid, it's a Swiss doctor, right, describing the fact that the Gavi Alliance also has immunity. Right. So does CERN. Right. And the question is, how did Bill Gates form a group that has immunity?
Well, it's attached to a UN agency. That's why it's under the.
Well, it's really funny because if you look at the history of sort of who is Mr. Global and the competition. Right. For power at the top, one of the things you see is, the Vatican had 2,000 years of diplomatic immunity, right, compound interest and no taxes. Right. And that is a formula that's very hard to beat. And when the Masons set up the United States, they went to great lengths to make sure that all the charters and pools of capital around the universities had the same benefit. Right. So they that's why so much of the funny money is playing behind the shield of tax exempt foundations like Gates, like Harvard, right, all these things.
In my client's challenge and lawsuit against the Bank of Canada, just for your information, Catherine, you probably know this, the Bank of Canada is not a private central bank. It is a public bank whose shares are owned by Her Majesty the Queen and Trust for the Citizens of Canada. And in that challenge, one of the things I was trying to do was to say, well, hang on a second. The Bank of Canada has a statutory obligation under the Bank of Canada Act to report to Parliament, yet it was refusing to reveal any of the minutes of the meetings at the Bank of International Settlements in Basel for all those years. And they, unfortunately, if the issue comes around, I'll try again, but the Supreme Court shut the doors on me, wouldn't hear the case at all.
Right.
But so just so the people are aware, you know, we don't know where they meet. We don't know whether they have Turkish showers or real toilet paper, but these International Bank of Governors of all the central banks meet regularly as part of Bank of International Settlements. And we don't
Right.
know
And
what
here's
they
what's
say.
important to understand. During the financial crisis, that what came out was the banks in this country were extended that immunity. They had immunity from prosecution.
Right. Right. And so
And that's, that's a coup d'etat. That's,
yeah, I agree.
if your banks are running the government bank account, trillions of dollars is going missing, massive securities fraud is proved and going on,
Right.
and yet they're immune from prosecution.
Yeah.
That's a coup.
Yeah, that's a coup. Yeah, of course, it's a financial coup. And I don't know if people notice. I point out to people often, you know, when you have meetings of the first finance ministers and prime ministers at international conferences, often quite unabashedly, prancing behind them like chihuahuas are the central bank governors. I've seen our central bank governor at these meetings on television. You know, I mean, they're trying to hide, they don't speak, but if you recognize their faces, you will spot them. And
well, I don't know if you see in the Biden administration, they're putting more and more people either from, the New York Fed or BlackRock, who's been
Right.
running Fed operations, in the different positions. I think Yellen's deputy is from BlackRock.
Right.
Or he was Larry Fink's chief of staff. So, my question is Larry Fink running Treasury?
Well, this is what we don't know, especially about these central banks that are not statutorily public banks and accountable to the nation state. Can you explain to our audience what the relationship between the central banks and the commercial private national banks is, if there is any?
Well, so let's talk about the United States. It's different in different places. In the United States, the 12 Fed banks, there's the Board of Governors who are appointed with political approval, but the 12 Fed banks are owned by their members, and that ownership interest, who exactly that is and what percentage they own is secret. Okay.
Right.
So the commercial private banks own those Fed banks and control those Fed banks. And I wrote to every one of the public relations office at all 12 Fed banks, and I said, what are your policies in terms of your members having access to your data and databases? And they wrote back and said, that's private information.
Yeah, as if you were dealing with the Vatican and the cardinal committees,
Right. So I would say those commercial private banks own and control the Fed banks.
Okay. And just so that the audience understands, in Canada, for Canadian viewers, that in Canada is the exact reverse, but same effect. When we were doing the case, we wanted to force the government to do what it had done between 1937 and 1974 in Canada. The statute, Catherine, the Bank of Canada Act still to this day allows for the interest-free loans from the Bank of Canada to the federal government for up to 30% of its annual budget, so long as it's paid in the next fiscal year, which is not hard because you pay 30% back and you re-borrow it the next day for this fiscal year.
Right.
And 25% of the provincial annual budget. And during that time period, all those interest-free loans were used for the building of what we call human capital infrastructure, schools, hospitals, roads,
Right.
St. Lawrence seaways. We paid off our World War II debt using that mechanism. And Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father, in his memoirs, or I can't remember if it was his memoirs or in an article, in 1974, he had the Bank of Canada join the Bank of International Settlements, and they put out a dictate that no central bank is to be lending any money to any government at reduced or preferential interest rates, contrary to what are being set. So the Bank of Canada is issuing bonds and selling currency to the private banks after 74 at prime at the posted rate. I mean, in the last few years, 1/4%, and then the private banks are turning around lending it to our government at commercial banking rates. A massive fraud. And so, in that sense, they own the central bank.
It's a systemic arbitrage that basically ensures that within a certain period of time, the bankers will own and control everything. It's a rigged deal.
Right.
So let me just say one thing, because you have a disadvantage in Canada, even though your bank is government owned. What you have is a small collection of banks. In America, the Fed tried to do something a couple of years ago. I forget what it was. It was about 5 years ago. And all the small banks just went nuts. And the lobbying and politics was incredible. And the Fed had to back off because there were still at that point over 8,000 banks in America. And of course, many of them are not happy with the system as it is, and are much more loyal to their community than to the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. So you're the number of banks you have a few very large banks,
yeah.
And you don't have anywhere near the rich infrastructure we still have in the United States of community and local banks.
Oh, no, I know. And the reason in that is the misfortune of history and culture, because in your country, you had a revolution. Historically, Catherine, Canadian banks, we refer to them, the big ones, as, quote, chartered banks. They had to receive a royal charter from the British monarchy to set up the bank. The only encroachment on that banking system was later, with these quasi banks of trust companies and cooperatives. But that banking system that you speak of, and I agree with you, it's lack of diversity in anything, in any market, is a liability. That lack of diversity and the existence of only a handful of chartered national banks is a result of that history. And it ain't going to change, so.
Well, it's so interesting when you drive around the United States, when you're in a place that has a good complement of local banks and credit unions.
Mm-hmm.
The economy is so much more diversified and resilient than when you don't. It's just so obvious.
Well, the notion of monopoly devolves from a monarchist system. Canada, the problem with Canada is that the political favor and lack of meritocracy comes from the very evolution of our culture. It's, a Polish friend of mine who lost most of his family in the Holocaust always says to me that his father used to say, when you want to try to bribe somebody back home, it's how much. And when you try to bribe somebody in Canada, it's who do you know? What's your pedigree? And it's true to this day,
So I just have to tell you, there are two things that historically ensure that a society will fail. One is you make the central bank privately owned, but the other is you legalize usury.
I'm sorry, can you illegalize usury?
You legalize
usury. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so you used the example of what the government was charged for the central banks.
Right.
The central banks right now are charging their owners, essentially, I don't know, in the United States, 0 to 1%.
Right.
Do you know what the average credit card interest rate is in the United States?
Right, 16,
the average
20%, 16 to 20?
16 to 17%. And of course it goes all the way to 30%.
And just let's pause there so our audience understands that the credit card system is a private, unbridled creation of money from nothing, from nowhere, correct?
Right, but there's something else too, and that is there is massive antitrust violations because no one will drop that interest rate.
Right.
And that means there's no market. there is an enforced scam, and they're all playing the game.
And it's so horrendous in Canada. I was around when they were drafting I was at the Department of Justice as a student, first year lawyer, with when our criminal interest rate provisions were enacted in criminal code. It was in the advent of the 80s, where you had 22% normal interest. So the government said, okay, if any fee or charge exceeds an effective interest rate of over 64%, it's criminal. So of course,
over 64%.
Right, over 64%. Well, not even, I could go to my neighborhood and see my local loan shark and get a better deal than that, right?
Oh my, well, the loan sharks were, in its day, the mob was a much fairer lender than the New York Fed member banks.
Well, do you know the structure, I've often, when I lecture law students and then we talk about the rule of law and the alpha structure of our societies, the organized crime is not structured any differently from any government. We just choose to say that this organized criminal organization, a government or military dictatorship, is not illegal because we just say it. And, Joe Bonanno, who just died a few years ago at 102, he often said that, what is different, all organized crime in the history of America, from the Irish to the Italians to the Jews to everybody else, if you counted the bodies that they accounted for in their own internal business, it would not match the daily death count of what the American military system kills in a country in a conflict in a day. And that's a fact. That's an empirical fact. I did a count from 1945 to 16 years ago. All the illegal bombings and military campaigns of the United States government resulted in the direct deaths of 14 to 15 million people, not counting collateral death from health and destruction. Direct bombings, and I have a list of there wasn't a single year. Militarism is not restricted to...
Right, but let's be totally clear. If you understand how the central banking system works, because they're running the payment systems.
Right.
The mob can't function for a day without the banks moving their money. They control.
Right.
So I'll give you a perfect example. One of my favorite Solari reports was an interview I did with Helen Chapman. Do you know who Helen Chapman is?
No.
Helen Chapman, you have to meet Helen Chapman. Helen Chapman is a force to be reckoned with. She was a very successful litigator. She did financial institution litigation in New York, and she had money in Madoff when it went down. And so for obvious reasons, her business was down during that period. So she decided she would help the victims. And one of the things she did was she got tax policies changed so that they could recoup money on their taxes. And one thing led to another, and she's in her own law firm now representing a whole bevy of Madoff victims. Anyway, she sued JP Morgan Chase under the Bank Secrecy Act. So I had her, and there's a lovely video of her on Fox News where they ask her what she's doing, and she says she's suing JP Morgan Chase over Madoff, and they get so scared they throw her off the show. It's up on our website. It's very funny. Anyway, so I'm interviewing her, and she said Madoff had two businesses. He had the investment advisory business, and then he had a brokerage business. And from the mid-90s on, his investment advisory business only had one bank account, and that was their bank account at JP Morgan Chase. So I said to her, Helen, who was the securities custodian? And she said, there wasn't one because they never bought any securities. And I said, but Helen, if they only had one bank account and they never bought any securities and there was no securities custodian, that means that JP Morgan Chase controlled and they were the senior partner. This wasn't a Madoff Ponzi scheme. This was a JP Morgan Chase Ponzi scheme or a U.S. intelligence agency Ponzi scheme, whoever JP Morgan Chase was working as agent for. but Madoff had no control.
Right. Right. But JP Morgan did.
They had total control.
Yeah.
And apparently Madoff used to leave billions on balance in the account, no interest.
Yeah.
Right.
So can I move on the road to COVID that we're going to get to? I'd like to quickly discuss with you historically, as this monetary system has evolved to the present, the relationship between human value, labor and capital, and monetary value. Do you have any insight into what you perceive has happened to the intrinsic human value of, let's say, a farmer, a construction worker, as it relates to the monetary value ascribed to them? And if I might, I'll just so you understand the question better. Nobody said it better or highlighted the problem better than Sultan Abdul Hamid, who reigned the Ottoman Empire between 1877 and 1909. And for 33 years, unsuccessfully, the Brits, Italians, French, and Russians tried to take him down because he was not in with this. He said that in the next 100 years, the bankers and the merchants will run the world. Kings and queens will be irrelevant, he said. And the central reason is the creation and control and printing of money that doesn't reflect real human sweat, blood, and tears. And the example he gave was, you take a farmer and their family, they clear the crops in the spring, they plant, they maintain, they cultivate, and they've got, 20 pounds of potatoes. And somebody with a 1 pound note, a piece of paper, comes by and says, "Thank you, give me those potatoes." And he said, "Well, is that fair? Where did that paper note come from? Is it justified, an equivalency of 20 pounds of potatoes coming from the labor of this farming family for 8 months of the year?" And so he resisted that banking system where, he had face-to-face dealings with the name escapes me, with the Dutch.
So I always thought the war on terrorism was basically the war on people who control oil and won't charge interest.
Real commodities. Iran, Afghanistan, and Venezuela were the only 3 countries who do not allow the foreign exploration of oil by private companies. So what do you say happens where you have a system where, if my father was a construction worker his whole life, he worked 70 hours a week, sucking in asbestos and silicone from the construction site, and he'd come home with $200. And now $200, you're issuing an IPO of a company that doesn't even exist, doesn't have a door, doesn't have anything. And 100 of those shares is more than my father ever took home from 50 years ago.
So the SPAC market capitalization just topped $700 billion, almost $1 trillion.
Okay, explain to us what that means.
SPAC is a securities vehicle that issues a blind pool. It says, we're going to raise capital and then we're going to go out and buy stuff. And when you're in the middle of a societal pump and dump, it gives you a war chest to then go pick up assets cheap. So if I tell 1 million businesses they're non-essential and they have to shut down, then suddenly if I raise capital with, I've $1 trillion raised in SPAC, then I can go buy up all their real estate cheap.
So is it fair to say that in certain senses, depending where that money came from, it's the equivalent of giving the native indigenous people of Manhattan a few beads and taking Manhattan? We're back to that now, in a sense.
Well, it's a little bit different because, and John Titus just finished doing for our annual wrap up. So I wrote State of Our Currencies and published it. But then I asked John to drill down and do a presentation on the going direct reset. Mm-hmm. So what's happening globally right now is the central bankers voted and approved on the going direct reset. And most everything we're watching is subsumed in that sort of that plan. And so um, essentially what they did, Rocco, is that they took the economy down.
Right.
And John really shows how that works. But when you take an economy down, the other thing he showed is typically the Fed would increase bank reserves, but that money had to stay within the banking system.
Right.
It didn't pop out into the general economy. What he's been able to show in this sort of analysis of going direct is they are infusing massive amounts of money into the general economy. And I think one of the places it's showing up is in these blind pools.
Right.
And it wouldn't surprise me, particularly through BlackRock, if these pools are being funded with purchases coming either from the there's several places at the New York Fed and in the Fed system it could come from. But I think it wouldn't surprise me if a significant amount of that money is being injected through. If you look at the money that was disappearing through the U.S. government,
Right.
When it started to go missing, we suddenly saw a lot of the private equity firms magically balloon with billions of dollars of cash, and nobody could figure out where they were getting all this money.
Right.
I think they were pulling it out of DOD and HUD.
Well, so just so that those who are listening understand it in sort of blunt terms, it's counterfeited printed money. It's
Right.
monopoly money with which
Right.
they
So-
they execute the same buying power that a family would take in 5 generations of working real jobs, right?
But here's what's happening. The difference between the beads and the Indian is now you're buying the Indians in a way that dramatically debases their existing assets.
Right, right.
So you're not only out trading them, but you're out trading them with their own money. In other words, you're using their money and their governance structure to basically destroy their assets. So,
Right.
I mean, when you look at the hubris and this sort of, it's kind of a very psychotic. This is really war. So,
Right.
so we're watching a financial coup, and now the consolidation of the coup is a war on the people you just stole the money from.
Right.
Right.
So I'd like to move on also to a point in line with that in terms of diminishing human beings and something I saw you.
So can I stop you for just
Sure,
a
go
second
ahead.
and insert something here?
Yeah.
Because I want you to go, I'm quickly learning you're a fantastic monetary historian. I want you to get a book and I want you to read the last 3 chapters.
What's the name of the book?
The name of the book is The Edge of the World by Michael Pye.
Okay. I had bought that book and it was quote borrowed, never brought back. I'm going to get another.
Get another copy.
The Edge of the World.
Here's
by
what
Michael
happened to
Pye.
me.
Okay.
So I'm reading this book because I'm very interested in what were the trading arrangements and the economic development along Northern Europe. The people who traded around the North Sea.
Right, right.
And I'm very interested in the Frisians, who were very astute and capable with currency and trading relationships.
Right.
So anyway, and the Hanseatic League. So I'm studying all this sort of medieval economic history. I get this book and I think I'm learning about medieval economic history and culture. And then suddenly I get to I think it's the 3rd chapter from the end. And to my shock and amazement, the title of the chapter is, are you ready for this? Plague Laws.
Oh boy. Yeah.
Plague laws. Okay. So it starts with the bubonic plague in 1300. But basically what Pye says is plagues allowed the leadership to consolidate control of the government into smaller, tighter, righter hands.
Right.
And that allowed them to control travel as well as who could do what labor. So complete control of travel, complete control of labor. And they were so able to then consolidate the intellectual and financial capital and the wealth that had been built on this sort of market basis throughout the North Sea, that they were able to then create Antwerp, Amsterdam, and modern civilization. Isn't that great? Now,
And so
I jump on that thought. So it looks like they had a plague every 100 years, 1340, the early 1400s, 1500s. So I go back and I said, this looks very interesting because, I did a very detailed chronology for State of Our Currency about the history of money and currency and looking at it chronologically. And so this is grossly oversimplified, but looking at the patterns, just pattern recognition, it looks to me, starting with the bubonic plague, that every 100 years you have a plague, you centralize laws, and then you move the reserve currency.
Yeah.
So there is a very, it looks to me like there is a relationship between plague and then concentrating power in the government and then moving the reserve currency for the last 500, 600 years.
And then we have the Spanish influenza 100 years ago. My grandmother died of giving birth to my father in 1918.
Right. And you see coming out of that, the Fed then moving in and holding a dual currency status with the sterling, and then with World War II, they go to the full reserve currency.
Well,
but if you go back and you look at, it goes the Portugal to Spain, then to the Dutch, then to the French, then up to the British, and then across to the Americans. And you look at the patterns historically of plagues, centralization of power in government, the creation and issuance of the bond market is definitely in there, and then the shifts in the reserve currency. It's remarkably astonishing.
And a lot of that is happening today, you say?
Well, here's what I'm trying to get people who are very knowledgeable about monetary history to take a look at it, because I think there's something there, and I don't understand what it is, but we're clearly dealing with a very old pattern.
Right. I'm going to come back to that idea, even on a mini point of local conflict as a means. You mentioned one of your broadcasts with the Fed Reserve branches, but I just have to say, because my friend may be watching this, I'm sure he's going to watch it. My best friend from law school, Mark Abbott, gifted me The Edge of the World by Michael Pye. And Mark, somebody borrowed it, never brought it back. I promise I'm going to get it back and read it. Okay.
Now, why did he want you to read it?
Because he found it fascinating. He said, you have to read this.
It's a fascinating book.
Yeah, he said, you have to read this because we're living a slice of this right now. He said, I couldn't put it down. And so can I move on to the idea of humans as a commodity resource and not a sovereign being?
Yes, so that's exactly what I want to talk about, is human labor. And can I talk about the African slave trade?
Well, I was going to say that was my first point. The African slave trade is a prime historical example. And then I want to talk about, quote, human resources today.
Okay, so this is my intuition. I was very struck by a book called The Half Has Never Been Told by a Cornell professor who did a remarkable job of studying and unpacking the economics of the African slave trade. And I'm absolutely convinced the most profitable business from the beginning of time is slavery. I think slavery is fantastically profitable, but it's very difficult to manage, and it's very dangerous and violent. There's a lot of risk. I became convinced reading his work that the reason that they gave up on the African slave trade was twofold. One was they couldn't find a way to perfect collateral, and the banks in London kept losing money. The commodities market would go down, the plantations would sell the slaves west, they could never find them and perfect collateral, they'd lose money. So that was problem number one. Number two was they couldn't put down the Haitian Rebellion. But if you look at what they've been able to develop with digital technology, surveillance, and space weaponry, they've solved those problems. Right. And that means they can go back to slavery, and it's unbelievably profitable. Now, what was interesting is, if you look at the Half Has Never Been Told analysis, my read of it, and this is my guess, is that at the time they were building the big plantations out in the South using slave labor, that if you brought a whole bunch of German farmers to Texas and didn't have slavery, you would have a much bigger economy. In other words, German farmers who would always build manufacturing skills and tools with it. So, they would always bring that sort of industrial component, even if they were doing farming, agricultural, ranching. A bevy of German farmers would create far more wealth. The problem is you couldn't centralize it and trade it on Wall Street. The big plantations, you could issue a cash dividend vehicle that the guys on Wall Street could centralize and make money. So freedom built a bigger economy, but you couldn't centralize the wealth and have central control. Because I mean, if you look at what happened in Texas, you had way too many German farmers to control them.
Right.
Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
So-
And I mean, the colonial powers became rich through the colonial slavery, and not just the abject buying and selling of human beings as property, but basically the theft through the economic system of colonialism. And
Right.
what people should remember about Haiti, it's quite interesting. Haiti
very
is touted
interesting.
as the poorest country in the world, but nobody reminds you why. Their revolution, their independence from France was so early. It was 10 years from the American Revolution. And yet, it's still the poorest country in the world. Why? All the colonial powers of Europe ganged up on them for 200 years to teach them a lesson that you don't do this to us. I mean, colonialism didn't start dismantling until
It was really
1947 in
funny.
India. Right?
When Clinton was appointed Secretary of State, I think it was right after that or right before that, suddenly Bill Clinton was appointed UN ambassador to Haiti. And I said, oh, they're going to hit Haiti. They're going to hit it really hard. And that's exactly what happened. So I agree with you. They have never gotten over the grudge.
No, never.
They have never gotten over the grudge.
And so can you address this? So where my spin of actual bondage and slavery and the so-called emancipation of slaves around the world, I saw it differently because it was, as you say, it was too hard to handle. They brilliantly said, "Well, we're not really giving you freedom. We're just going to enslave everybody else on a different plane." What do you make of this term, this corporate term that emerged in this century of, quote, human resources? I mean, when we refer to human resources, we never really are referring to human, spiritual, or rights-based resources or education. We're talking about them as an economic.
We're talking about human livestock.
Right. I'm sorry. Say that again, please.
Human livestock.
Okay. Can I use that term?
Yes.
Okay. So that's what we're talking. When we talk about human resources, we're talking modern day slavery, even worse.
Well, so if you look at the slavery, first of all, what they're saying with digital technology is, there was an expression once upon a time: a man's home is his castle.
Right.
And what you've watched is the central powers try and intermediate every function. So instead of having a well and getting my own water, suddenly I have a water system and I have to pay taxes to finance the building of the water system, and I get a water bill. That's all the financial system reaching in and intermediating all these functions.
Right.
But now the financial system is saying, something, I get to intermediate what you say in your home and what you do in your home. So I can watch you through your TV. I could do surveillance. I can listen to us have this conversation. I can record it. I can film it. So I intermediate. And now what you're seeing with the injections and nanoparticles and brain machine interfaces, something, I can stick my operating system not just in your computer and put a backdoor. I can stick it in your body and have a backdoor. I can intermediate your molecular biology with my, Moderna calls it plug and play technology. They call it an operating system in the software of life. So they're saying I can intermediate you down to the molecular level.
Right. And the last fall there was a World Economic Forum report commissioned by WEF, written by two McGill University professors, entitled "How to Make the Human Body an Efficient Information Platform." Okay. So, Catherine, before I
You
move on,
gotta send me that one. Wait a
well, I'll
minute.
send it to you, and they're
Oh
quite
my.
unabashed about it. If you haven't read it, you got to read it. And
Okay, so I
and
just
that
have to
report,
mention.
Catherine, sets out that already they have 7,000 volunteers with physical chip insertion in their arm and their in their ear, maybe
Rocco, here's what I got to tell
else
you. Not
places.
not everybody's going to make it.
No.
It's a
So
war, and
before I
not
move on
everybody's going to make it.
to the next
So,
one, Catherine, sorry.
so this brings us to entrainment and mind control.
Talk about mind control, and I want to go there on my next topic of transhumanism. But very briefly, before we get there, we were
Okay.
talking about slavery and human resources as a. Can you just weigh in on this notion of how Mr. Global is assessing humans versus robots as competing production and profit units?
Right. So I believe that Mr. Global believes that robotics, a combination of robotics, software, and AI,
Yeah.
can do many functions today that are done by humans.
Right.
But they have a question. My experience with the financial leadership is they're always prototyping. They're great believers in trying stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Just try it, see what happens. And so the world in one sense is always in perpetual prototype. And so if you look at a continuum with a human being,
Right.
all the way to a robot, the question is, if you can combine digital technology and integrate it into humans in various ways, whether it's brain machine interface or a cybernetic arm,
Right.
so you have human, you have robot, and then in this middle you have a cyborg, and all these different variations along
Right.
the continuum. And I think they believe, as a legal matter, if you can create a definition for a human that integrates and incorporates a robot, if you try and create two legal systems, one for the robot and one for the human, and two different taxation systems and two different regulatory systems, you will have $1 trillion expense, and it will take decades. Whereas if you simply change the definition of what is a human to include a robot, then you can do all these different prototypes in the labor system and go much faster and simplify. You just have to dramatically debase what is a human and what is the law that applies to a human.
Right.
And part of what you're watching is a desire to avoid having two different legal, payroll, and taxation systems, which can get unbelievably confused, because as you integrate more digital technology into the human body, it's going to get murkier. The continuum between what's a robot, what's a cyborg, what's a human is going to get very murky. So they figure, just dump them all into one pot, change the definition of what's a human, and then we don't have to worry about that. We'll handle it in one standardized system. And it makes that system much easier to globalize.
And obviously, I mean, it goes without saying that the human is always the loser in this equation, because we lose what's intrinsically our nature, don't we, along the way?
Well, here's the thing. The vision is so psychopathic that it's almost impossible to describe why it's going to fail.
Right.
Because if you understand, if you look at how intelligence works and how shared intelligence works, what you know is that robots can't do that. And I think one of the reasons they're so eager to hook us up into the cloud and get us all hooked up in this transhumanist vision is the same reason that when you're outsourcing to India, you send your workers over to train the Indians. In other words, if you can hook all the robots and all the humans up into the cloud, then the humans can teach the robots through the cloud how to do everything. Right. Now, if you look at the social distancing and the different COVID rules, they're trying to get humans to act like robots to somehow make this simpler. It's not 100%, but they're trying to create, if because if you understand us as electromagnetic beings and how we share intelligence and create and share fields, it's like they're trying to stop all of that and get us to resonate with the machines through the Wi-Fi instead of with each other or the all living things, and
Right.
get us into a model where we're much more robotic.
Right.
And intuitively, what that tells me, it's all part of making it easier for the robots to learn from us on how to replace us on all these different functions.
Right. But Mr. Global sees the human just like a robot in terms of his utility or her utility to him in economic terms, in terms of production output and uh, uh, uh,
So here's my guess.
Yeah.
This is just a guess.
Right.
Mr. Global, just pretend for a second that you're Mr. Global and you're responsible to produce a dividend every year that's 10% more than it was last year.
Right.
And that's what you're trying to do. And if you don't achieve it, you and your family will be killed. And just pretend that goes on year after year after year. And you start looking at, okay, what can create the biggest secret amount of money? Because remember, you're not trying to create the biggest economy or the biggest dividend.
Mm.
You're trying to create the biggest secret dividend that you can centrally control, which produces an unbelievably different economy. And that raises the question is, where is all this money disappearing to, and why do they keep everything secret?
Right. And for those watching, or for those who are going to reply and hurl all the conspiracy theorist allegations against this kind of view of what's happening, I just want to remind people what Stephen Hawking, the greatest physicist this planet's ever produced, said about a year before he died. And he said that there's two great threats to the human race. Number one is artificial intelligence and robotics, because it's going to dehumanize us for sure. And number two, he said, for alien invasion, and don't assume the alien invasion is going to be friendly. Now, everybody conveniently recognizes Stephen Hawking as one of the greatest thinkers of all time, but everybody conveniently ignored and pretended that he didn't say those two things because
So
they can't, they
one
can't
thing you
process
learn
them.
when you study artificial intelligence is the guy who has the best AI in terms of winning in the economic battle is the guy who has the most data. Good software developers don't make AI great. Data makes AI great.
Okay. So
And
let's go on to that aspect of data and transhumanism, and I want to touch on a few things. Bill Gates has patented a cryptocurrency based on human data. We in Canada, Catherine, have an act of parliament that we short form refer to as PIPEDA, PIPEDA, Personal Protection Act, right? And I have currently a constitutional challenge to the pivoting section of that act. Under the guise of protecting your personal information, any and all employers, without the knowledge or consent of their employee, can collect, use, disclose, and monetize that personal data, usually in the form of medical and other personal information, right, for insurance and other reasons, right? And so that's going to be heard sometime next year. I'm sorry, this sometime at the end of this year. And people, can you comment? I see this as part and parcel of the sucking out of us what is human. And in your country, you can do something we can't do here, thankfully, yet. The United States of America allows the patenting of particular human DNA.
Right.
You could give away your own DNA in terms of rights to your own DNA. And so that human data, and as you say, artificial intelligence, everything is going to the collection and monetizing of our data. And can you shed some light apart from the profit motive, why they would be going that way, Catherine?
So I'm not sure I understand your question. I mean, one of the reasons they want this sort of this digital invasion is because the more data, if you can digitize everything,
Okay.
if you can digitize the atmosphere, the clouds, the buildings, the people, then you're going to win because you have more data, right?
Okay, but what does it do vis-a-vis Mr. Global's control of the individuals whose data they possess?
Well, the more data you have, the smarter your AI gets, the more your AI can do.
Okay.
Okay. So the launch of transhumanism is to build the smart grid, including into our bodies, so you can get that data and run more and more things with AI.
Okay. And so if you're patenting a cryptocurrency whose value is based on human data, right?
Right.
Then whoever controls that data is going to shift. It's going to shift the financial monetary system
Dramatically.
right?
And remember, so that crypto is not a currency, because what you're talking about is not only creating a digital transaction system that will give you the maximum data,
Right.
Integrated with many other things, but it will also give you the ability to shut somebody's money off. So you can do a one-by-one bail-in. Everybody's worried about bail-ins, but the bail-ins will not necessarily come by bank. They could come by customer one by one.
Right.
Okay, Rocco, you offended us with this lawsuit. We're turning off your money.
Right. And how they get there is by having me have a direct relationship with the central bank administered by the existing private banks?
No. Having a relationship with the bank, and the bank can not only turn off your money, but take your money.
Take your money.
Yeah.
Okay. Or pretend it's not there.
Well, I was searching for software to do ACH on my website, and I drilled down. It's a long story. It took 2 months of reading documents and getting another term and condition, getting another term and condition. When I finally read the terms and conditions, what it said was I had to be compliant with the following 5 to 10 laws related to the financial system, as well as any other laws globally that might apply now or in the future. So it was completely open-ended. And it said if the company deemed me to be not in compliance, their bank reserved the right to go into my bank account and take whatever money they deemed appropriate and keep it for 6 months with no basis in law, no court action, nothing.
Okay.
It gave them the right to do a bail-in on me as one person.
Yeah. Maybe you can explain for the audience the difference. Our finance minister, since the 2008 bank crash, has put every taxpayer in Canada on notice that they will never bail out the banks and that we're bailed into their debt. Could you explain in simple terms what a bail-in means?
Yeah, a bail-in is, instead of the government giving them money, is they just take the depositor's money.
Right. Okay, so Catherine, can we now get to the point of you sharing your views? I'm sure a lot of my audience at this point is under a nice blanket because most people don't have the interest in money you and I do. But can we talk about the pandemic, COVIDism, and the globalist agenda as you see it, vis-a-vis how they are trying to shift and change and eliminate national currencies and what they're trying to do with the current monetary system through the pandemic measures?
So I'm going to refer to state of our currencies and then our analysis of the going direct on the Solari.
Right.
So if you want detail, there's more detail. There's tremendous detail and tremendous documentation on everything I'm going to say. So I just want to point that out. The central bankers agreed to the going direct reset in August 22nd, 2019. And I think one of the reasons they did it then.
Stop right there. Can you just please explain to people, in Reader's Digest version, if anybody remembers Reader's Digest, what the reset is?
Well, that's the $64,000
No
question.
question. Okay.
We know what they've written about.
Right.
Okay, so if you go to the commentary on our website where John and I present the Going Direct Reset, there are lots of links to some of the documents at the BlackRock. BlackRock, there's a group of central bankers at BlackRock that developed and wrote the plan.
Right.
And so we know what they've written about it publicly, and you can find it there.
Okay.
But essentially, what I think they're hoping to do is to build a cryptocurrency system which allows them to radically re-engineer the government, which the central bankers are essentially taking over. So we've had this balance of power between the electorate and the central bankers, and the central bankers are now sort of moving in and taking over. But I think what we're looking towards is the shift to a global reserve currency out of control of an elected U.S. government or even a U.S. government. We're globalizing the currency, and central banks around the world are working on issuing central bank digital currencies. It's not clear how they will roll up into one global reserve currency. You don't really need to have to do a new currency. Part of this will be the increase authorized by the U.S. For the SDR system at the IMF, which will permit the IMF to help buy all the countries into the tent. Now, the beauty of COVID, so they voted on this in August 2019. In September, the Fed went into the repo market and started putting out trillions of dollars to the banks.
Right.
We then go into the next year. The market runs up. We then go into the next year. It was clear that part of this was they wanted to get rid of the populist surge. There was literally a war on populism that was happening.
Right.
And so you're trying to shut down the power of the electorate in the big democracies. And so we move into 2020. And what you need at this point is you have a portion of the economy which are independent producers. So we have two classes of people, the people who can print money and the people who can earn money. So this is Main Street. This is mom and pop businesses. And essentially what you're looking at is the people who print money want to basically buy out and shut down and roll up that part of the economy. Now, if they were going to do that at market prices, it would be one price. But if they can shut down those businesses and put everybody in a debt trap, they can pick it up for a song, right?
Right.
Okay. So you have, so you create a situation where the government declares all of the independent producers, who are, by the way, financing the populist candidates.
Right.
You declare them non-essential and shut them down. You put them in a debt trap. You get them hooked on government subsidy. You get their employees quitting or leaving or going on employment compensation. And then you pump massive amounts of money into the private equity firms and the big banks, who then basically suck up and take over the whole economy. And that's why literally within a matter of months, we had the global billionaires up fantastic amounts,
doubling their equity. Yeah.
Right.
Because
it
doesn't take a banker to see that, if you're closing down a mom and pop shop, Main Street, as you referred to it. In Canada, we have King and Queen Streets because we're a monarchy, but,
right.
And you can't sell shoes when 4 or 6 people a day will go in, but you have to buy your shoes at Walmart and Costco.
Well, I'll bet you, I don't know what the statistics are, but I'll bet you by shutting down the churches, they dramatically increased Amazon and Netflix sales. Everybody stays home and streams.
Oh, for sure.
Right.
For sure.
So let me give you some statistics.
Okay.
Insider Intelligence just published an email saying retail sales were down 3% last year. Now, I think that number is low because they're not including a lot of the mom and pops. But e-commerce sales were up 27.6%.
27%.
Yeah. Now, if you're playing this game and you're running this game, a 27.6% increase in your revenues can translate into thousands of percentage on a leverage basis increase in your private equity, your venture capital, or your stocks, which is why, generally the equity markets have done very, very well.
Right. And so you're
And it's
saying
being led by it's what I said before about the slavery business. You're consolidating the revenues into the companies that are centrally owned.
right. So will we in 10 years hold $100 note in our hand? Will there be a stock market?
Oh, I definitely think there'll be a stock market. I don't know if there will be paper currency.
Right.
I mean,
And
we will be much better off with paper currency. And if you look both in Europe and the US,
right,
the resistance to going without paper currency is very strong. People
right.
want paper currency.
And so you talked about the creating a dependency, and everybody is touting a guaranteed income model. Let me tell you what happened in Canada about a week and a half ago. There was a private member's bill by my local, actually, member of parliament that went under the radar, that is gone through first reading, that says that the Minister of Finance, no later than 2 years from now, has to come in with concrete proposals to implement a guaranteed income for every Canadian.
Right.
And at the same time, shut down and eliminate the Canada Pension Plan, which is a contributory, like your Social Security pension plan, because it got moved out of consolidated revenues and was handed to a committee of trustees, investors, and for the last 4 months has been doing quite well in China. They moved the entire national pension plan fund to China. And within 2 years of the proposals, they want to implement the system. And here's some of the boomerang effects. Currently, if I want to retire in a warm country, and most of us do in Canada, at least for a good part of the year, I can take my benefits, the contributory system, and take them and use them in wherever I go. Well, once you shut down the CPP, a guaranteed income, you can't have it in another country. You're not going to get your medical and dental and eyeglass and drug benefits that come with that CPP. And so this has gone under the radar. And I was wondering if there's any whisper or gossip in the States about it. Because this happened in China,
So there's been
Russia.
a lot of concern. They tried to float an idea of converting 401ks and IRAs into annuities.
Right.
So it stops being your asset that you can get.
Right.
And you have an annuity that's essentially dependent on the federal credit mechanism. And if, I'm assuming, if you're not good, it can get tinkered with. And so it stops being your asset.
Right.
And at your death, it's gone and your heirs can't inherit an asset.
Right.
Anyway, so they've tried to float these proposals, and the last time I remember them doing it, the pushback was just off the charts. Now,
right.
I'm assuming if they go with universal, here's what they want. I mean, when Klaus Schwab said, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy.
Right.
What he's basically saying is, we're going to take all your assets, we're going to chip you, and we're going to mind control you, and you're going to think everything's okay.
And what do you say to people who say, well, that's just an outlandish conspiracy theory?
Well, what I have to say is, I'm not telling you what I think he's going to do. I'm telling you what he said.
Yeah, you're telling us what he says he wants to do.
Well, no, he told us what was going to happen.
Right.
Not what he wants. He presented it in terms of a fait accompli.
Yeah, I've seen the ads with the 22-year-old good-looking kid who's smiling about not owning anything, but he'll be happy. Yeah.
Right. And what I would tell you is, I think the number one obstacle between us and freedom is mind control. And if you look at the technology and investment they've made in, everything from bad education to propaganda to entrainment technology and subliminal programming,
right.
It's very, very serious. And we have a world of people who are ingesting through their smartphones unbelievable amounts of entrainment technology and subliminal programming that has been designed to influence them in ways they don't understand, that they're unconscious of.
You're not a fan of a guaranteed income for people outside of the context of physically or neurologically disabled, or really people who really need it.
So I have no problem with a great social safety net.
Right.
but I have a big problem with being dependent on psychopaths.
Okay.
And any system which engineers forced dependency on psychopaths is very dangerous. Because
So-
that universal, if you think the terms and conditions are bad, that I just described on this potential relationship that, I never consummated. If you think those terms and conditions are bad, wait do you see what the terms and conditions on that universal basic income is going to be, 5 years after the system is going.
It's going to be, what is it going to be in your view? It's a Chinese style credit system of social
You
control?
would be lucky. You would be lucky if it was just a Chinese style social credit system. It's going to be far, far, far worse. I keep telling people death is not the worst thing that can happen here.
And what is the worst thing that can happen?
Well, the worst thing that can happen is they walk into your home and say, "We've decided we need your kids. We're taking them. Goodbye."
Right. And so I have my partner here who one put up her hand to ask a question. Go ahead.
Just on the idea of UBI, did she see that as like a slippery slope? You know what?
What's UBI? Sorry.
The universal basic
Yeah.
income.
So Raj is asking, do you see the universal basic income as the slippery slope to our control?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what you can't do is you can't talk about the universal basic income divorced from all the other questions
Right.
of who controls.
Right.
In other words, my most valuable asset is not my money, it's my time and my health. If you give me a universal basic income in a way that destroys my health and my body, destroys my spirit, destroys my love, destroys my family, destroys the people I care about, destroys my environment, so what?
Yeah.
So
And
we can't talk about a universal basic income without talking about, okay, what's the package? And you know something? The package is worse than death.
Well, what I say to people is that being fed and having a universal basic income and having all your needs met happens in federal prisons when you have a life sentence.
There you
But
go.
you're still doing a life sentence in federal prison.
Right.
I don't see it as much different from that, really. Myself, as a lawyer, as a constitutional lawyer.
Okay, so I'm just going to say something because I don't know if you realize this, as a matter of full disclosure, I should say, I was asked to be a governor of the Federal Reserve.
Yes, I saw that. I didn't raise that because I didn't want you to have to say 7 Hail Marys online.
But you have to understand that the people running this have very serious occult practices
Yes.
that reflect values which are very alien to most of the people listening to this.
Right. And my question is, do you think these globalists consider themselves as part of the rest of us humans?
No.
Okay. Can you expand on that?
I think they now view us the way, you would view chickens in a farm. In other words, we have become as if we're separate species to each other.
Right. Okay. So, looking at from my basic, a very, very obtuse point of view, they are creating a system where digital control.
Okay, so I have to stop you. Can I interrupt again?
Sure.
Don't say they.
Don't say what?
If you don't say they, because if you look at this system that's being built, they are not building it. We are building it.
Yeah. We're complicit.
Oh no, we're more than complicit.
We want it.
It's way beyond complicit. It's not like they're the bad guys and we're the good guys. I have watched I split from the establishment because they were dropping SWAT teams into poor neighborhoods, rounding up innocent kids and putting them in slave labor camps. I said, we can't, if you keep running a negative return on investment economy, ultimately it's going to get to everybody.
Okay.
So, and it turned out that was correct. And now it's, now it's come for you and me. But if you look at the complicity, at least of the American people in narcotics trafficking, in the military industrial complex, in going into places all around the world like Libya and raping them and stealing their stuff, and Russia, this is not them, this is us. And we are standing in the psychic storm of our own evil.
Right.
And that, if we can face that, that's where we get the power. Because if we're building this prison, if we're building our own prison, we can stop building it.
Right. And I got to confess to you, Catherine, that, in my sorry, 62 years on this planet, I never believed in good or evil until COVID came around.
Oh, I believe in evil. I've seen it. I've dealt with it.
Yeah.
There is real evil. We're dealing with a serious demonic force here.
All right. So we have a system that's on that's teetered that's on the brink right now, whereby the Mr. Global is digitizing not only the monetary system, which leads to control. He's digitizing our data. He's digitizing our body, and basically, the way I see it, dehumanizing us from the intrinsic God-given or mother-given attributes of free thought, conscience, belief, speech, association, assembly, life, liberty, and security of the person, and the right to be treated equally with every other human being. And Mr. Global is doing that because he controls all those things that are not intrinsic to immediate physical needs of human beings. But he's also moving there. And I'm referring to, Catherine, food, agriculture, housing, health, sanitation, right? So he can't replace a lot of that with robotics. Even agriculture is problematic. Yet now Bill Gates owns 300,000 acres of farmland in America.
Right. They think they can make synthetic food, and
Right,
that
right.
will make them more money than
Right.
real agriculture.
And so they're moving to that. They're moving to that. So let me
So can I ask you my tax question?
oh, sure. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah. I may not be able to answer it.
Well, no, but we're in cahoots. We're thinking about it, and I would love to have a much longer conversation with you about this. But essentially, the fundamental challenge in the United States, I'll use the United States, then we can go to other areas, is the taxpayers are paying taxes to a government that is using those taxes in violation of the law.
Right.
And so what I've been able to do over the last 25 years is significantly document repeated violations of the financial management and the constitutional framework for financial management and the financial management laws and regulations. So we're paying taxes and complying with the laws to pay taxes, and they're spending the money illegally. And under the Constitution, we have a responsibility to make sure that the money isn't spent illegally.
Right.
Not to mention, if you finance someone who's killing you with your money,
Right.
If I pay the government money and then they use that money to destroy my business with COVID-19,
Right.
that's clearly not sustainable.
Right.
That's in violation of the UN sustainability principles.
Right.
Okay, so the question is, how can I achieve the equivalent of a citizen's arrest of the tax money? Okay, now, in many years ago, there's the government, but they're the private banks and corporations that run and control the government, because the government financial operations are not run by government employees. They're run by private banks and private contractors. Okay, that's how it works.
Right.
So in 2006, when I settled the litigation, I paid off all the existing creditors, and I wrote to Citibank. I owed Citibank $14,000 on a credit card, and I said, I'm asserting a common law right of offset.
Right.
I owe you $14,000, but if you look at how much money has disappeared from federal government per person. The missing money at the time was $14,000. I said, I'm asserting a common law right of offset, and I'm going to offset what I owe against what you owe me as a citizen because you're the depository. And I said, if you have a problem with that, here's my attorney's name and feel free to contact her.
Right.
I never heard another word.
Right.
That was
So-
it.
So let me try to answer that question for you, Catherine. Ironically enough, again, I go back to my Bank of Canada case. That's one of the issues I was dealing with in that we still, both in Canada and the States, have a constitutional right of no taxation without representation. So So what happens, in my view, is that where the government is either not being transparent, because back to the Magna Carta of 1215 and the right against scuddage or tallage, remember the tallies that we used to measure money? Only Parliament can impose it, but that requires a free and transparent process. And so where they're not being transparent, or you have no representation or say in the democratic process, we take the view that that's unconstitutional taxation. Now, can you proactively arrest somebody on a citizen's arrest? No, because usually citizens' arrests are restricted to, acts that are happening before your eyes, and they tend to be non-monetary acts unless somebody is breaking into a place to steal. But what you can do, you can't use that constitutional right as a sword, but you certainly can use it as a shield and say, you know what, I'm not paying my taxes because
I don't think that works. And I'll tell you why it doesn't work. Here's what I think would work. You say, you know something? You owe me, and now it's over 100,000. So, but we just use 100,000 per person. So I'm a family of 4. That's 100,000 per person, or 400,000. You owe me 400,000, and this year I owe you 20,000. So 10,000 of that amount is going to go to the military and the credit, the interest on the federal debt. I'm sending you 10,000 for the military and the federal debt, and the other 10,000 I'm putting in a local escrow for the domestic expenditures that you fund through the federal budget.
Right.
So you know something, we'll cover those needs here through the escrow. We don't need you to collect the money in Washington and send it back in a very expensive, paperful process. We'll just take care of our neighbors with the money. And we'll file our taxes, and it'll all be filed, and we're complying, and that money will go in the escrow, and it'll go for those purposes. But that's to make sure you can't spend it illegally.
Right. Well, that was tried in the reverse by the Quaker community in Canada a few years ago in a case called Pryor, where they said, listen, our religion dictates that we cannot contribute to war. We don't believe in war. Therefore, we're taking our percentage of what goes to the military budget and we're depositing into a peace fund, and you can spend it on peace. And what the Supreme Court of Canada essentially said that that's unworkable in a democracy with such diverse interests and beliefs that all have to be respected. So in essence, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's was the response from our Supreme Court.
Right.
So that's a tough one. I think, as I said early on, historically, all rights for human beings in the Western neoliberal tradition came out of a tax revolt. If you got enough people saying, I ain't paying, it'll work.
But I think when you say, I ain't paying, you've got to prove that what you're doing is bringing the law, not helping them debase the law further. That's number one. But number two, now that you have so many citizens dependent on money from the government, you've got to be willing to step up and make sure that their social safety net is protected.
I'm not so sure that. See, I take, again, this is why I had to disclose my full disclosure where I come from in terms of my political beliefs, right? If it's a part of that social safety net for that small minority of people who are disabled, who cannot work, who cannot.
Right.
But if you choose to take that guaranteed income and there's nothing wrong with you, I don't feel that I have a duty to take care of you.
Oh, I agree.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
if people have put money into Social Security their
Right.
whole life,
Right.
and then you say just when they're due the money back, oh, we're going to abrogate.
Yeah.
So I really feel, when people talk about debt relief, that's not what they're talking about. They're talking about asset destruction.
Right. Well, they're burning it. They're burning they're burning the
They're burning everything,
everything to
all
the
the
ground.
different securities they use to
Right.
empty out your pension
Right.
funds.
Right. Right. And
Rocco, if you keep putting your head up there, I'm going to think I'm giving you a headache.
no, because no, I this is just a habit, I'm trying to avoid, what my nervous habit is? Most people bite their nails and other
Uh-huh.
people curl their hair. I wear my hair like this because I have a bad habit of scratching my head. So the hand goes up there, but it just stops short, But no, you're not giving
Okay.
me a headache. This is, I love listening to you because you have such a clear focus and a deep understanding of this stuff. So do you think these globalists are going to succeed in this plan to burn it
No.
down, buy it
No.
all, take it all up,
But I
enslave
don't
us
believe it
digitally?
because I think at the root of this is a spiritual war.
Okay,
I think this is a 10,000-year-old spiritual war,
right,
and I think they're going to lose, and I think they're going to lose because what they're doing is contradictory to the fundamental nature of the universe. Their model is incompatible with life. I
right,
don't think it'll work.
right,
And I think ultimately, if you look at the culture they have to manage the planet, I think they're going to kill each other.
right.
I call it, I don't know if you know this story. My favorite Bible story is the story of Gideon.
Gideon, yes.
Yeah. And in Gideon, the story of Gideon wins, not because he wins, but because the Midianites kill each other.
Right, right.
And I truly believe that's what's going to happen here. The Midianites are going to kill each other. And
Okay. I certainly hope so. But in the interim, short, medium, and long term, what advice do you give to those of us who don't agree with this agenda, who want to keep our humanity, but we act within our first circles of our
so
own
the first thing you
family
have
and
to do,
friends?
stop building the prison.
Right,
Number one, go find the other people who are not going to build the prison. Some of,
okay,
I hate to say this, but if you've got family and friends who are building the prison, there's going to be a separation here.
right, right.
If you don't want to join the cult, you have to leave the cult behind.
Yeah, so hang with people who feel like you.
Find your family.
Right.
My favorite mystery writer, Andrew Vax,
Mm-hmm.
has an expression. He says, your family are the people who won't turn you in. Go
Right.
find your family.
Right.
You need to be around people and companies and institutions of integrity. So,
Right.
and you need to understand at the bottom of your tippy toes that death is not the worst thing that can happen here.
Okay.
And then you've got to figure out how to build as much resiliency outside the system as you possibly can in a way that you're very productive. We all
Right.
have to be very productive.
Okay.
And
So
then we keep trying to build the kind of society, a human civilization. We need to do everything we can to preserve the culture, within ourselves. I keep buying, hardbacks of Aristotle. So, no, because they're going to burn the books, so we've got to preserve the
right.
great books. I just downloaded, all Bach onto an MP3
So
player.
okay. So you're taking care of the nest at that point. But when you leave the nest and you go on the sidewalks, does that include not masking if you don't want, not getting tested if you don't want, and saying no thank you to all the other measures that they're putting out?
It may mean moving to places where you don't have to do that.
Okay. But where do you do that, Catherine? Because, I look around the world and I'm shopping. Listen, I've lived in a lot of different places. I was born in Italy. I studied in Quebec. I had an office in Vancouver. I spent 5 years with my first spouse in China off and on.
Wow.
And now I'm looking at other places like Turkey, the Azores, and Portugal. But then I read up on their measures and they don't look much different from ours here. So I'm teeter-tottering with this. Okay, do I move to a farm and arm myself here, Or do I do it in a foreign country where I have no rights?
So I don't know the answer to that,
Okay.
but I'll tell you how I solve that problem.
You're in Holland.
Yeah, but the way it's a process. In other words, I absolutely, because I've lived through tremendous amounts of violence and harassment over the last 25 years, and enormous amounts of sort of, all different pressure brought to bear. Um, I really believe each one of us comes here for a purpose. And if we're serving our purpose, we're safe until it's time for us to leave. And so, what each one of us has to decide, what is my purpose? What am I here to do? What am I here to contribute? Why am I here? And if you follow that purpose and you ask for protection, you'll be protected until it's time for you to leave. We're all going to leave. We're all going to die. It's, to me, it's just a passage. And part of doing that is not only finding that purpose and the communication. What the way I would say it as a Christian is, I need to have a relationship with Christ, and it needs to be an intimate personal relationship, and I need to download constant intelligence so that I'm, wherever I'm going.
Right.
But I absolutely believe that if you are following your purpose, you're going to be safe in the middle of a battlefield.
Right. Well, let me share a story with you about my father, who was interned by Mussolini for about 5 years.
Wow.
He refused to serve, and he was court-martialed twice. On the second court-martial, they said, if you don't serve, we're issuing an order of execution. And he said, well, go ahead. You can kill me once, but you can't threaten me twice. And he was at peace with that. He said, but I will not serve in your army.
Wow.
And so I, a lot of people would say that what you just said and accepting it with the calm that you do, that's courage, right? Because a lot of people are trying to find that escape to just avoid the hassles. And it's as you say, if you realize that, as Bob Dylan said, it's life and life only, right?
Right.
And you're
Well,
comfortable with that in terms of standing up for what you are and who you are and maintaining your humanity. I guess you would have a lot of less angst. Is that what you're saying?
So, what I see, how can I describe this? Because I was always somebody who believed in getting along and working with other people and collaborating. And you can't be too, you have to compromise. Part of, part of society and getting along and collaborating is compromising. And so I've never been one to be sort of intolerant and demanding. And yet in 1998, when I decided I would refuse to settle and I would really fight, it was because there's certain lines you cannot cross.
Right.
You can't cross those lines because it's a difference between being human and inhuman. And you can't do that. You can't. What's the point of being here? And part of that is I know that my soul is immortal. Why would I give up immortality for my soul? I mean, I think that's what this battle is about at the root.
Yeah.
What they want is to destroy the immortality of my soul. I'm not doing that, because I'm an investment banker and I know that an infinite cash flow is a much bigger present value than anything they could trade for it here. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense
Right.
to me, and I'm
So-
sure a lot of my the viewers will be shocked that they're hearing about the spiritual worth of your soul from an investment banker. They generally don't.
To
they
me,
generally
everything-
don't go.
I have to
hand in
express
hand.
everything mathematically.
So listen, I have two quick questions before we conclude, Catherine.
Okay.
The first is, in the course of my work, not just in this context, but especially in the course of the COVID litigation I've been doing, I get a lot of nasty, hostile, violent messages, including death threats on a regular basis. Do you get such messages?
I really don't get a lot of nasty messages. I'm pretty
Okay.
lucky.
Oh yeah. Okay.
I do get a lot of, the comments on the internet
Right.
really make you worry about what's happening to IQ levels.
Well,
You get a lot of people who don't understand the powers of the law of attraction,
right.
and what they're doing is they're putting out energy that's going to cause them to attract garbage.
Right.
So you see a lot of bad manners and bad behavior, and I find it to be very concerning,
Yeah. Yeah.
because I think they're being encouraged and trained to be that way now. I think a lot of them are just defense contractors who are paid to trash people.
Right.
But as you know, you have to be, the only way you can, this is a little bit like energetic bushwhacking. Have you ever done a lot of bushwhacking as a hiker?
As a hiker, no, I was thinking of bushwhacking with a shotgun, but how
Well,
are you
but
using the word bushwhacking?
you have to cut the trail,
Okay. Okay. Okay.
and you have to get up every morning and say, I chose to cut this trail.
Right.
It's difficult in some respects to cut the trail, but it is my purpose,
Right.
and I am grateful for the opportunity to do it.
Right.
And what I have to tell you is, despite, spending years basically completely isolated with a big, target on my back, and nobody wanting to associate with me socially because I had a
Right.
target on my back. As things have turned out, I feel like I'm the luckiest person in the world.
Right. Well, I share that. Don't get me wrong. It's not that I was asking because, I'm traumatized by it, but, given that most people, in the words of George Clooney in the movie Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, are dumber than a bag of nails, I'm happy that they're not at my door, wanting to discuss everything under the sun. I'm quite happy with the peace and quiet to let me work. And as you say, pursue my destiny, you know? So,
I don't know.
so
I really believe that if you're lucky enough to have the knowledge that you have, or that I have,
yeah.
it's absolutely imperative that we use that knowledge to help people as they see fit, not as we think they
I
need.
totally agree. I act on the
Right.
instructions of my client. I'm lucky. I'm in a profession where that
Right.
is a tenet of what I do. And what I do as a lawyer, what you do as an investment advisor, say, what do you want? What do you want to achieve? It's not
Right.
what
But
I want, but
right. One of the things I discovered when I first started down this role was that most of the citizens of America are under terrible stress and pressure, and they have terrible pressures on their time. And the last thing they need to hear is about more corruption from me. Do you know
right.
what I mean?
Yeah.
What they need is, they need to hear from me something that will save them time, lower their expenses, generate them income,
Right.
and make them feel hopeful about their future and their kids' future.
Of course. Okay. So the question on everybody's mind watching, right? And I have to ask it. I'm sorry, right? I have to, I'm going to have to
Do
ask
you
it.
really eat Taco Bells? What?
No, I've never won. Listen, I had an observation. We were driving with my spouse and kids in Northern Ontario, and it struck me. And this is an American invention, right? The sublime marketing of all these fast food joints, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Taco Bell, all of them. They're all the little buildings where you go in. They're all built like a little church, a church local church with a steeple. Did you ever notice that?
Yeah, I did. So Rocket, you have to promise me, if we do this again, you let me tell you my Taco Bell story.
Well, you can tell it now, but we're definitely
No, no,
gonna.
no, no. It's
Okay,
too long.
okay, we're definitely gonna do this again. And here's the question, and it has
Okay.
two parts. Where do I put the cash that I have in my bank right now? And is there any bank, especially in Switzerland, that where I could survive this for the next 12 years if I decide to keep my bank account?
So this is a global system,
Right,
and if you look at the terms and conditions that are, that Mr. Global is trying to lay on, it's the goal is to have it to be universal.
right,
But I think different jurisdictions, different cultures, different institutions matter.
right,
So you want to be in a bank where you have very high quality governance, very high quality management,
right,
and where you have serious support in the community for that bank.
right.
And they're well capitalized. So if you can find that, it's a wonderful thing to have.
And if,
So I'm a believer in having money in the bank. I'm also a believer in having lots of resources outside the bank. And I'll tell you my favorite
such as what?
one.
Such as what?
Did I tell you how I survived the litigation?
No.
The financial trick? Okay. When I got, the situation started in 95, but then it grew and grew and grew, and it sort of came to the big attack in 98. They were trying to falsify evidence and sort of frame us. And in the process, they destroyed the business. They shut down every form of income and credit coming into me, and then did everything they could to dramatically increase my expenses. So
Wow.
I'm in this financial vise. And so I have no way of generating income. So I'm spending down assets. But I made a list in 1998 of all the money I had given or lent to close friends and family. And it was $250,000. And over the next 11 years, and that was money they could never shut off.
Right.
Over the next 11 years, members of my family gifted or lent me $250,000 exactly.
Wow. Wow.
So I put it out in the People Bank, and then the People Bank said, well, I guess she needs the money back. And it didn't necessarily come from the same people. I had a wonderful, wonderful uncle who was wealthy, and he said, well, she helped everybody, and now I'm going to help her.
Yeah.
And he really made this system go, because there were people in the family who would have sort of walked away from me, but he wouldn't. He said, how can we, she never walked away from us. How can we walk away from her? Anyway, so when I settled the litigation, I took a huge amount of the money that came in, and I just bonused it right back out.
And you relented back. Yeah,
I said, the People Bank is the bank I can trust.
Well, we have a saying in Calabrian, Catherine, when you're owed money by your family, you'll never be broke.
Well, I remember, I've done this with clients when I was still doing investment advisory, who said, I just don't trust the market. I don't trust the system. And I said, how many kids do you have? Never forget this. One guy, he said, I have 5 kids. I said, how many mortgages do they have? They said they each have a mortgage.
Pay it
I
off.
said, refinance them out at a lower rate.
Mm-hmm.
That's an annuity, right?
Yeah.
You got an annuity. If you don't want to be bothered with the servicing, you could put a local credit union or bank in the center to do the servicing. But that's your annuity, that's your income, and then you don't have to worry about whether the market's going up and down. So I saw him a couple of years later. I said, how you doing? He said, well, I missed the run up in the stock market, but I sleep at night because I refinanced all 5 kids out of their mortgages.
Oh, that's great.
I got a steady income. Now, if you look locally at many communities, you've got the institutional investors saying, the individual investors saying, I need more income. And you've got the mortgage guys who are saying, I don't trust the system,
Right.
But I want to do a mortgage, but I don't trust what happens when it goes in the machinery. And I keep saying, will you two talk to each other?
Right.
Because there's a local solution, or there's a family solution, or there's
Right.
a network friend solution,
Right.
but we're going to have to start talking to each other.
Yeah. And so, but if you don't have a mortgage and you have some cash and you don't really trust the banks, given what you said about the global system,
So-
would you
so
would
the
you buy
first-
some silver and sit on it?
The first thing I would do is I would set up my personal situation to dramatically lower my overhead by doing more for myself or my neighbors. And I
Right.
would start with fresh food.
Right.
So, I just had one subscriber who I made promise me that she would spend no more than 10 hours on the campaigns in the United States last year, and instead take a big slug of money and build a 75-foot greenhouse.
Right.
And that's what she did. And now she's got, and she was her kids were so impressed. They all came home and helped.
Great.
So now they have a greenhouse that can feed the whole family if they need it.
Right.
So-
I'm doing just that from a place out of Wisconsin. The prefabs them, they're shipping out. They dug up ones and underground.
Fabulous.
And you would
Okay.
recommend that to people.
I would recommend doing anything you can to permanently improve the resiliency of your infrastructure and
Right.
lower your expenses.
Right.
Now, that doesn't mean you have to do it. Not
Right.
everybody likes to garden,
Right.
but you have other people. I mean, why finance Bill Gates buying farmland when you can finance your neighbor building a farm that will feed you?
Right. Right.
We
Listen-
we just had an opportunity here to finance one of the websites that aggregates farmers' goods for purchase,
Right.
and they offered investment opportunities in their business, and they agreed that they'd pay dividends in either cash or food.
Fabulous.
Right?
Can we
So-
remind people that one of the most successful banks in the history of banking was Benjamin Franklin's bank, who pegged the value of his dollar on agricultural producing land?
Right.
Right. Yeah. Listen,
Um,
Catherine, this has been an absolute pleasure
Well, I was
for
going
me.
to tell you 10 other places you could put your.
Oh,
you
go
put
ahead.
your
Yeah,
assets.
Go ahead. My son will wait. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. So the first thing I would do is do anything that can permanently lower your expenses and increase resiliency. Okay.
Yeah.
Then I would have liquidity, not just in cash and coins, so precious metals definitely, but I have boxes of little whiskey jars.
Hey, listen, we're on at Edam there. I have a supply of the best scotches and wines. They'll be
Right,
the
so,
last
but I have the
relinquish.
little bottles because I want to use. I'm planning on using them in a currency if the time comes.
Okay.
Okay, so cash, coins, liquidity. There are many different arrangements you can do with precious metals.
Right.
We won't go into the whole
Yeah,
thing, but I
yeah.
would definitely do that.
Yeah.
I think the best investment in the world, although it's very tricky, is to have a successful operating company that can generate an income.
Right.
I absolutely believe in investing in your skills, your own business,
Right.
and your children and grandchildren.
And that would include passive income through rentals if you're not mortgaged, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. But your law practice, or, I don't know what your kids do, but don't let your kids suffer for lack of investment in starting and building their own skills in business because you've got money,
Right. Right.
in crypto.
Right. Right. Right.
And
So
then
invest
I
in
think
human
that-
capital and yeah.
Right. And then I am a believer in the stock market now. Like anything in the system, from the post office to the stock market, it has its pros and cons.
Right.
But there are great companies all over the world being run by good governance, good management, and they make the world go, and we need them. And we need financial liquidity. If we lose financial liquidity, we're toast.
Right.
So, I don't like the financial system running our society because I think you can't trust the money people to run the business.
Well, it's not a question of the system. The only problem with the system is not in the system. It's in the corrupt individuals who've taken control of it. Is that all right?
Well, but we've allowed the financial group to take and extract a higher and higher percent
Right.
of the economy
Right.
and
Right.
compromise the law. And you have to run your society where your culture and your law are independent from finance and they are not a subject of price.
Right. So before I knock off my media partner, Raji Kabli, it begged me on the sidelines here. She wants 5 minutes with you.
Wrap up with her.
We've wrapped up, you and I, right, Catherine? Listen.
Yes, you're free to go.
All right. Okay. So I really thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. I'm definitely going to harass you for another interview in the near
Okay.
future. I don't think, people who don't know the history of money and how the financial systems work and don't work and how they oppress us might have found some of this boring, but I think it's critical because it's their future.
Yes.
Okay. So thank you
So-
very much, Catherine.
So
Go
can I
ahead.
just say one more thing?
Yes, sure.
The deciding line in history will be as to whether or not we are free and have a human civilization. Will
Yes.
we allow the creation of wealth and money and currency and equity to be controlled centrally, or will we decentralize? This is at the heart of whether we will be a human society or a free society. So as boring as it is, we're going to have to grapple with it.
Choir music to an anointed anarchist. Thank you very much. I hope to speak to you soon. Okay?
Bye, Robert. Have a great evening.